Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Roy Culpepper. I'm the chair of the group of 78. And first thing I'd like to say is what an enormous pleasure it is to see everyone back at a G78 luncheon. So welcome to all and thank you for coming, and hope that this is going to be the first of a number of luncheon events. So let me just go on to say a few other things. Our guest speaker is here, and I was afraid that he was going to come on his bike because he's famous for getting everywhere on his bike. So I wasn't putting any odds of him being here, but he actually came by car. So thanks for doing that, Fergus. So our luncheon webinar is on prospects for ambitious reform of the UN, and our distinguished guest speaker is Fergus Watt. I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being held in Ottawa, which is in the traditional unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, which continues to be home to Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land for millennia. It delights me to point out that this is the first in-person luncheon event that the Group of 78 has convened in well over 3 years, when the pandemic made such meetings impossible. However, we did not stop meeting. Like many other organizations, we adapted by moving to virtual webinars using Zoom conferencing software. However, we're not going back to that pre-pandemic status quo ante of in-person meetings, since we wish to take advantage of the Zoom technology and continue to provide virtual access to those who cannot join us in person, including those far outside of the Ottawa area. This is also the first time we're convening in the new Desi Zaika restaurant. I'd like to thank the proprietors of the restaurant for accommodating us in this wonderful space in West Ottawa. We hope that our hybrid format goes ahead without a glitch, but we beg your understanding if we encounter technical problems. And as I speak, our online participants are joining the conversation. Our distinguished guest speaker, let me say a few words, Fergus, will talk about prospects for ambitious reform of the United Nations. Fergus served for 36 years, you heard that right, as executive director of the World Federalist Movement, Canada. In 2021, he stepped away from active involvement with the WFMC to focus fully on the work of the Coalition for the UN We Need, the C4UN, where he coordinates the coalition's small 7-member Secretariat. C4UN serves as a global platform for civil society engagement worldwide in the follow-up to the UN Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report in 2021, and in the run-up to the September 2024 Summit of the Future, about which we'll hear some more. Many in civil society, let me say, have not been as aware as they should be of these crucial discussions at the UN. So we enlisted Fergus, who's been immersed in the discussion in the past 3 years, to enlighten us. Fergus will focus on the current state of play regarding the intergovernmental preparations for the summit, including negotiations on elements of Pact for the future, as well as the work of civil society in advancing an ambitious reform agenda for the United Nations system. I'd like to mention in passing that the Group of 78's annual conference, which relates to the issue of civil society engagement in reforming global governance, our conference will take place on September the 27th to 28th on the topic of Civil Society Confronts the Climate Emergency, Mobilizing to Eliminate Fossil Fuels. Susan Tanner is with us for lunch. If you have any questions on our upcoming conference, please talk to her or myself. Fergus is going to speak for 25 minutes, after which I shall ask one of our distinguished guests with us today, Doug Roche, to make some comments on Fergus's presentation. I shall briefly introduce Doug before giving him the floor, but first, over to you, Fergus.
Great. Thank you, Roy. Well, it's great to be here and see many old friends with the group of 78. The group is, I've been familiar with the group since they were founded in the early 80s, and they've been a consistent pillar of thought leadership on Canadian foreign policy, progressive Canadian foreign policy, and multilateralism for all those years. So I'm happy to be part of the reinvigoration of the in-person meeting format. I did provide on the tables some copies of this document, which is a bit of a cheat sheet, really, for what I'm about to speak about. It's a document we prepared in advance of a conference earlier this month in Nairobi, a UN civil society conference, and it's basically a summary of the state of play as of about the end of April on the negotiations for the Pact for the Future. So if there isn't sufficient clarity in what I say, you've always got the cheat sheet to fall back on. And for those online, I understand it's been or about to be distributed in digital format, and it's also available at the website of the Information Clearinghouse for the UN Summit of the Future, which is a small sidebar project of the Coalition for the UN We Need. So on September 22 and 23 of this year, the UN will hold the Summit of the Future in New York, bringing together world leaders to agree a new international consensus on what the UN's website describes as delivering a better present and safeguarding the future. One of the outcomes of the summit will be a pact for the future covering 5 key areas: sustainable development and financing for development, international peace and security, science, technology and innovation and digital cooperation, youth and future generations, and transforming global governance. So those are the 5 chapters. Governments are negotiating this pact in the lead up to the summit based on a 0 draft that the co-facilitators of the process, Germany and Namibia, distributed on the 29th of January. And following consultations since then, there is now, just last week, a Rev 1 of this 0 draft out, and I'll speak to some of its highlights at the end of my remarks. In addition, the Pact for the Future will contain 2 annexes, a global digital compact, and that process is co-facilitated by Sweden and Zambia, and a declaration on future generations, co-facilitated by the permanent representatives of Jamaica and the Netherlands. So we're in the late stages of this UN reform negotiation process. How did we get here? Dedicated efforts at reform of the modalities and architecture of global governance don't come about every day. The last such sustained effort was 2005, the reform initiatives initiated by Kofi Annan. The origins of this process are rooted in civil society campaigning. In 2015, an independent commission, the Albright-Gambari Commission, which was sponsored by the Stimson Center in Washington and a Hague-based Center for Justice at the Hague Institute for Global Justice, published a report. And you know, like many of these independent commissions, there's numerous recommendations, but one of the recommendations built on a standard UN mantra, which is never let an anniversary go to waste. And so they recommended that the UN's 75th anniversary, which was in 2020, 5 years away, should be an occasion for stock taking and reform, not just a birthday party. Some of us in the World Federalist Movement latched onto this as a bit of a campaigning idea. We were lucky enough to get funded, and beginning in January 2017, held some consultations among various civil society networks and key missions in New York. The call to strengthen global governance came at a time of declining international cooperation across many sectors. Some of the funding cuts at the UN, brought about by our friend Donald Trump, actually helped our work, contributing to a sense among small and medium governments at the time that there really was a need to come together and work to revitalize global governance. And so momentum grew for the idea that I just enunciated, that the 75th anniversary should be an occasion for reform. And that led to the Secretary General's office, I should point out, was also supportive of this, and the UN Secretariat was supportive right from the get-go. Another big contributor to momentum for this idea was a Secretariat-led, what they called a global listening exercise, where people were just asked their opinion, and you know, there was opinion surveys and just a lot of mobilization around the idea of, you know, people addressing what the UN means to them, what it needs to do to do its work better, etc. So the Secretariat has always been on side with the idea. Then in 2020 and it was actually into 2021 that the UN 75 declaration that commemorated the 75th anniversary was passed. The facilitators of that process were Sweden and Qatar, and it identified 12 areas of concern. What, you know, governments pledging to do more of what they've been doing, and, you know, the typical areas of UN activity. But it also contained an important operative paragraph that mandated the Secretary General to report back with recommendations to advance our common agenda and to respond to current and future challenges. So a year later, the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda report that Roy mentioned included nearly 90 recommendations to strengthen global governance. One of them was a proposal that a summit be held in 2023. That was perceived by some delegations to diminish from the attention governments needed to pay to the 2023 SDG summit. So the summit of the future was moved to 2024. In the meantime, General Assembly discussions in 2022 and 2023 focused on the summit of the future modalities, and then more substantively on what's referred to as the scope and elements of the proposed Pact for the Future, the Pact for the Future being the main outcome from the summit. The scope and elements discussions were supported by a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism that was co-chaired by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, and Stefan Löfven, a former prime minister of Sweden. And the Secretary General's office weighed in again with 12 policy briefs and lots of behind-the-scenes management efforts and for the diplomatic process that was underway. And although, as I said a minute ago, that the 2023 discussions were aimed at establishing the scope and key elements of the proposed pact, in fact, there was not a consensus on anything more than a bare bones outline of what the scope would be. Basically, the 5 chapters and the 2 annexes that I mentioned a moment ago. Consensus on the broader elements of the package was blocked by some of the same governments that had insisted that the summit be moved to 2024 in deference to the SDG summit, and these are governments that prioritize development issues, SDG commitment fulfillment, and so on over some of the summit objectives. So the discussions on reforming the UN are not isolated from some of the geopolitical tensions we read about daily. We hear often that the so-called US unipolar moment is passing, and that we are entering a so-called multipolar world order. And these dynamics are not. Oh my goodness! Sorry about that. Should have done this earlier. So the geopolitics that condition, international events are also, unsurprisingly, I guess, having an impact on the negotiations. And what I just mentioned about some governments prioritizing SDGs and international financial architecture reform, for example, over other possible summit outcomes are one example. So some of these dynamics are reflected in some of the ways that the summit is being organized. A key element of this process is a key driver is the SG's office, a team in the executive office of the Secretariat General. So we have Antonio Guterres he's a Portuguese former prime minister, and so we have a Western SG and a team driving this process made up primarily of US and UK nationals, and there's a bit of resentment amongst other governments for what is perceived as a Western-led process. Meanwhile, there's a group of states, most of them, but not all of them, from the G77, which is the group of 77 and China, the mostly developing countries. They're prioritizing, as I said, that some of the SDG and development-related issues. These governments are also insist on, many of them are authoritarian governments, and they insist on, quote unquote, the intergovernmental character of the United Nations, which is a way of saying that NGOs and other stakeholders stay aside. This is something that we governments are going to, this is high politics, and so some of the dynamics that many of us have been familiar with in terms of progressive reforms at the UN, landmines, International Criminal Court, Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, some of these, and most, perhaps the best example, the 2015 development of the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of these dynamics where NGOs have been welcomed and encouraged are not happening in this process, and that's another big determinant of the scope and ambition of the Summit of the Future. These governments are also not the best friends of UN human rights issues, and I must say that the two areas of the UN's work that are let's say least well reflected in the proposed Pact for the Future are human rights, the human rights pillar of the UN's work, and also environment. you'd never know it was a global climate emergency affecting almost everyone on the planet, from the language in the Rev 1 draft. I'm oversimplifying in terms of some of these generalizations about the dynamics and contending points of view. The G77 is not a monolithic group by any stretch, and on any given issue, and there are a great number of issues, that proposals in the Pact for the Future. There are many different perspectives from within groups of states, of course, and that's always the case. When the first Zero draft was released, there were a series of consultations. Member states expressed their views, and then the co-facilitators published a compilation draft that had all these, so that governments could see all the different perspectives. And the Zero draft ballooned from 20 pages to 242 pages with all of the different, and that's not surprising. That's the way things go at the UN, but it does reflect some of the complexity and richness of the different perspectives. And I'm just, with limited time, I'm just generalizing here. And just on the point about civil society access, by way of a footnote, I guess, I don't want to, leave the impression that this is just the access issue is to be blamed entirely on some autocratic Southern governments. Western governments also have their own reasons for limiting civil society access in this process. The West, particularly the US, have always saw this as an opportunity for a modest set of measures that would strengthen and make more and modernize the UN that they had led for since its founding, and correspondingly, a wide open door to civil society was just not on, lest that lead to a much larger, more expansive, more ambitious, and things spinning out of control. So there's lots of blame to go around when it comes to how we navigate the access issues. And this document, this information clearinghouse project, is a bit of a response to that. As co-facilitators aim to keep NGOs out, we aim to keep civil society engaged and informed. And so in preparing, this is one of many documents that, if you go to the website, chronicle the state of negotiations and in a summarized, objective way. And it's a way to keep civil society informed and help broaden the constituency for the summit outcome, to socialize the process and generate wider buy-in. So the discussions, they have been challenging. At a conference I attended a couple of weeks ago in Nairobi, however, there were, as I mentioned, over lunch, there were a number of governments and Secretariat people there, and some of the people from the SG's office were quite optimistic. I was pleasantly surprised. They were optimistic that an ambitious outcome was possible, and they might even say likely. We'll all have to wait and see. So that Nairobi conference, by the way, was the 2024 UN Civil Society Conference, aligned with the Summit of the Future. The UN has these civil society conferences most years. They took a break during the pandemic, but this was the 69th in the UN's history. Usually these things are held in the summer, and they're kind of like a bit of a jamboree and not very useful. But this one was intended to be aligned with a particular UN process. It was also well organized. So CSOs attending in Nairobi, if some governments thought that sending civil society to Nairobi. I mean, why Nairobi when the negotiations are in New York? One might ask. In fact, it turned out to be an organizing opportunity. The attendance was great. It was well organized. There were 20 impact coalitions, new initiatives on global governance reform that were the outcome of this document. The co-facilitators and other UN diplomats decided at the last minute that they had to engage. The Secretary General came and gave remarks. It was Nairobi was another important development, a benchmark in this process. Not so much to influence the negotiations, but as I said, as a movement building exercise. And really for me, as someone who's spent a career, grinding away at some of these global governance issues, the most rewarding element of this process is the engagement from NGOs globally, that people now recognize, with international politics being what they are and the UN being what it is, that there is a need for attention to this question of institutional dynamics. What are our global institutions? What are they? How do they achieve legitimacy? How should they be structured, and so on? So to me, that's the longer term reward, I might say, for in this. I mean, for many years, NGOs have been kind of swimming in their lanes. Whether you're working on human rights or gender or environment, what have you, but it was always difficult for entities, even in Canada, groups like the Group of 78, to engage a more cross-cutting set of discussions on multilateralism. But I think that's changed, hopefully for good and for the future. So, okay, Nairobi's history, and just after the Nairobi conference, the co-facilitators released the Rev 1, as I said, the revised version of the zero draft. So in the few minutes I have remaining, I'll speak about some of the highlights. The Chapter 1 talks about sustainable development and financing for development. There will be an SDG stimulus, but governments are still discussing what that will look like, but there will be one. They gave a push in the text to finalize a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. Thirdly, they gave a push to some existing processes. The newly mandated World Summit on Social Development in 2025 and the upcoming Financing for Development Conference. And finally, the Secretary General is to submit a report in advance of the 2027 SDG Summit on process, what succeeds the SDGs in 2030. So that debate is just beginning and is initiated and given a push in the Pact for the Future. Chapter 2 discusses international peace and security. Personally, I find this a disappointing element of it began with the Secretary General's perhaps inappropriately named document on agenda for peace, a new agenda for peace. Many of us recall the old Agenda for Peace as a transformative document that Boutros Ghali initiated in the 1990s. But the current Agenda for Peace proposals and some of what has emerged in the Pact for the Future is quite disappointing. The general thrust is an emphasis on prevention and post-conflict peace building, but prevention, the Pact serves to push the onus of activity to national governments. So national prevention strategies is the order of the day. The document also makes more, gives a push to the decline of UN peacekeeping, which we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, we used to have almost 120,000 peacekeepers, civilian, police, military in the field. We're down around half of that now, and the initiative is now being more formally delivered to regional organizations. In the case of the African Union, this may make some sense where the AU does the peace operation and the UN provides the funding, but think of all the other regional organizations in the world. Regional organizations are not created equal, and many of them have no mandate in this area. So it's a problem. The Secretary General is meant to convene annual high-level meetings of regional organizations to move this process along. But to me, this is a very retrograde development. Doug may have a different perspective on some of the peace proposals and in the Pact later, and you're only getting my impressions here. So the document is available. We can all review it and take from it what we will. And I should say that the document, the Rev 1 of the Pact, it contains I think 51 separate action items, and each of these action items has subsidiary point A, point B, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of content there. There's a lot of material, but at the same time, much of it is language that reaffirms this and confirms that and gives a push to existing processes. So I'm trying to pull out what's new and in my judgment significant, but rest assured that there's a lot in there, and sometimes in these documents the most important developments are not noticed at first. So anyway, that's just a caveat on what I'm presenting here. Chapter 3 introduces the Global Digital Compact. It's a compact, which means a set of principles. It's built around UNESCO recommendations on, and including the UNESCO recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence. So it covers the cyberspace as well as AI. Chapter 4, Youth and Future Generations. It introduces the declaration. It refers to the special envoy on future generations. I mean, there is one of the aspects of this whole multi-year process has been a real spike in the engagement of young people in the work of the UN, and there's now a youth envoy to help make that a more permanent and more just to secure the participation of young people in the UN. Chapter 5 is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of institutional and legal reforms. It's called Transforming Global Governance. So they proceed first with recommendations on the main organs of the UN. Interestingly, on Security Council reform, there's there's a little placeholder in the Rev 1 draft in italicized text that says that the co-facilitators, it's a co-facilitator's note, member state and stakeholder inputs, that reform of the Security Council remains a priority for the Summit of the Future, and we are committed to achieving an ambitious outcome in the Pact for the Future. We will present initial language on this in June 2024. So it's like a stay tuned note. The reason for this is that there is already, as many of us know, something called the IGN, the Intergovernmental Negotiations on Reform of the Security Council, and it's focused mainly on representation issues. The Pact for the Future negotiations are not intended to duplicate or replicate other processes, so they have to wait for the IGN to finish their deliberations in May, and they will be providing some recommendations that the co-facilitators will use to provide a suggestion for the period from June through September. I think we all know enough about the UN to know that Security Council reform is a big deal, and so this is something definitely to be watched. The next recommendation talks about the General Assembly. And there's language about to address evolving global challenges in full compliance with the Charter, make full use of the role and authority of the General Assembly, and enhance ways the GA can contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security. I mean, many of us who've witnessed the dysfunction in recent years in the Security Council have been somewhat cheered by the General Assembly sometimes stepping up. There's an accountability mechanism in the GA when the veto is used, for example, and other. So there's the summit is green lighting and encouraging more of that. There's also an important recommendation on selection and appointment process of the Secretary General. I'll speed up. Another key recommendation. I mean, many of us here have joined Voice of Women delegations at the CSW. There's a recommendation that the Secretary General provide recommendations that the modalities, functions, working methods, and procedures of the CSW be reformed, and so. Obviously, this won't be easy, but there's a mandated set of discussions on the CSW hearings each year bring more people to the UN than anything except the opening high level week. It's a huge event for a process that has very little political traction, so it's desperately in need of reform. And then there's some language on the Peace Building Commission. Nothing that sets the heart aflutter. But there's then the next five in this chapter on transforming global governance. It's an interesting construction. The next five action items address international financial architecture reform. It's as if the co-facilitator said, "Well, you see, it's in here." But in fact, it's language that does nothing more than call on the board of the IMF to take further steps to enhance representation and voice of developing countries, and calls on the board of the World Bank and other multilateral development banks to enhance representation and voice of developing countries. And then there's some other, as I mentioned, there are five of them that talk about other aspects of IFA reform. The substantive one, in my view, is one that promises an increase in funding for the International Development Association through its next replenishment. So there is a promise of a little bit more money in the process. But some of us are now, the G77 have a whole different set of ideas on what IFA reform should look like and can look like. And there's nobody really has a handle on just what should be the UN's role in this. There's been dysfunction between, the policy setting role at the General Assembly and the implementing role of the Washington-based institutions since the founding of these organizations, and overcoming that by giving the General Assembly a role in IFA reform would probably be a marker of progress. So I'll conclude with, I guess, just to summarize, maybe 4 takeaways. In sum, what we're looking at now is a modest set of proposals which collectively modernize and strengthen the role of the organization. But that's where we're at now. There's an unusual trajectory to these negotiations where there's a baseline and a sort of a minimal. We're at a minimal point, but now some of the most ambitious ideas are being introduced at the last minute, and so there will be a kind of a high octane set of last minute discussions. So if some of you are coming to hear what's going to be in the summit of the future, you're going to be disappointed. It's the message is let's wait and see. Another takeaway is the, as I mentioned, the engagement of civil society. Civil society now recognizes the importance of this. Major civil, the major groups and other stakeholders system is now deeply involved. It's not just something that the Coalition for the UN We Need is pushing. And the last point is the point I made earlier about UN reform reflecting and being conditioned by wider geopolitical shifts. Historically, some of these institutional adaptations have taken place after major world wars. As we know, the League was founded after World War I, UN after World War II. So I guess the point I'm making is that any progress on institutional reform is good news. It means we're not waiting for a cataclysmic conflict to create a let's start from scratch moment. It's adapting to geopolitical shifts and power dynamics. And who knows? I mean, with the prospect of an engagement on reform of the council and further discussions on some of the other key elements in the Pact, including primarily international financial architecture reform. The outcome at the end of the day may surprise us and may give reality to the title of this event. In other words, the use of the word ambitious. We might get ambition in the end. Anyway, I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Doug and the views of others. I hope there's time for a few questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Fergus. We all feel incredibly indebted to you for spending so much time and effort on challenges which to many of us seem forbidding. And we have to wait for those moments that set one's heart aflutter. It's like the prospect of Security Council reform. Surely has to be at the top of the list. But time is running short. Let me go on to introduce our first speaker in the discussion period, Doug Roche, who wishes to make some comments on Fergus's remarks. The Honorable Doug Roche, an officer of the Order of Canada, is author, parliamentarian, and diplomat who has specialized throughout his 50-year public career in peace and human security issues. He lectures widely on these issues and on nuclear disarmament themes. Mr. Roche was a senator, member of parliament, Canadian ambassador for disarmament, and visiting professor at the University of Alberta. Doug is author of some 25 books. His latest is Keep Hope Alive, Essays for a War-Free World. There are some flyers at the front table here for those who are interested. However, he joins us today not to talk about his book, but because he's a passionate advocate for the reform of global governance, the subject of Fergus's luncheon discussion. Doug, we are honored to have you with us today and to hear your remarks.
Thank you, Roy. And thank you to Fergus for a very solid overview, Fergus. And even if you didn't set our hearts aflutter, you gave us a lot to chew on. If I can mix my metaphors. I want to take a moment just to thank Roy Culpepper, to express my deep appreciation to Roy for the 10 years of leadership he has given to the Group of 78, which has been through the years a very important organization that I pay my respects to. So, Fergus, I agreed with your evaluation of where this is going. It's better to have it than not to have it. And to the extent that leading governments can put a strong input into the summit of the future, and here, of course, I speak of our beloved Canada, it'll be a success in the sense of moving a multiple complex agenda at a time of world paralysis. I mean, there's really such a paradox and contradictions in the world today that it's just to have this event, I think, is itself a plus. Now, I said a word to Fergus about chapter 2, which you found a bit disappointing, and I share that. It certainly doesn't stir you, but in dealing with international peace and security. But it does say that several member states have urged the revitalization of the role of the UN in disarmament, and that this should include a special session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament. And this would be the long-awaited 4th special session, following the 3 special sessions that were held in 1978, 1982, 1988. And what makes it so poignant today is the grave crisis that we are experiencing now in the nuclear disarmament machinery that has collapsed. And I can't even begin to go down that avenue of detail of how serious the situation is with respect to nuclear disarmament, a field that I have paid very close attention to for the last 50 years. And this machinery breakdown cries out for the kind of riveted attention that a special session could foster. So maybe the summit of the future in dealing with this subject can move the agenda forward. The documentation in this chapter 2 also points to the need of implementing the existing nuclear commitments that arise from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and of course the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the relatively new treaty. All of these need to be elaborated to move toward further reductions in nuclear weapons today. I very much fear that the present multilateral paralysis, in this paralysis, nuclear disarmament will get short shrift at the summit. Even though Mr. Guterres has said, and I quote him, the summit will be an important moment for the world to gather around concrete reforms to the global disarmament architecture and the bodies and institutions that uphold it. So I certainly hope that Canada will take that seriously. So how can we get Canada to press the case forward? To its credit, Canada has been in the forefront in the past in nuclear disarmament diplomacy, but I'm afraid this could not be said of Canada today. Perhaps the Group of 78 that helped to press Canada forward. We are a distinguished group going back to times when the government was more receptive to hearing from civil society, and maybe we can help to revive some of that now. The G78 was a pioneer in establishing the relationship between disarmament and development, which is really at the core of everything that's going on today. Less money for arms and more for development and more security for all. That's the basis of the common security agenda. And so the G78, the Group of 78, has good credentials to speak out in this global crisis that we are now experiencing. I'll just take this moment to tell you that so serious is the crisis on the nuclear disarmament machinery that the four major nuclear disarmament groups in Canada, I speak of the Canadian Pugwash Group, the Canadian Network to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Canadians for a Nuclear Weapons Convention, and Project Plowshares. So serious do these four groups consider the crisis that they collaborated for the first time in a joint effort and holding a roundtable last October, which produced a report for the government, and followed that up now currently with a paper that is called How Canada Can Regain Leadership in Nuclear Disarmament, published by the four groups. And this paper is now in circulation, and perhaps some of you have received it because it's on various lists. But if you have not received it and you want one, just let me know and send me an email to djroach@shaw.ca, and I'll ensure that you get one. I think that this is the time for civil society to recover the strength that is so badly needed to inform the government of Canada today. Thank you, Roy.
Thank you so much, Doug. We have some limited time to have a question and answer and discussion period. People are joining us online. So, do you want to read the comments and then respond?
Sure. So we'll start online, and then people here may have questions. The first is, whoops, what's your step one? Susan James, lots of initiatives to tackle. So recommending revamping the power structure of the organization was not on the table. Depends on who you talk to, honestly. I mean, NGOs certainly had an expansive view of what could and should be on the table, but many governments did not. So, and as I said, I think the design and the leadership emanating primarily from the Executive Office of the Secretary General, in terms of the recommendations that are the crux of the discussions, you know, that was intended to be a more limited set of reforms. We're not just, you know, throwing the UN overboard and starting from scratch. It's a pragmatic set of reforms. But as the discussions evolved, there's a wide array, and there's many governments that do see the need for ambitious reform, not just civil society. So I think there's a range of answers to that question about what could and should and is and isn't on the table. And I think what I tried to reflect in my remarks is that September isn't the end point. First of all, there's implementation of summit commitments, and there are many. There's, you know, I mentioned a number of important processes and multilateral processes that immediately follow. But there is an appetite and a constituency for further reforms. The reforms of the IMF and the World Bank and some of the other economic governance bodies that have been started and are ongoing. They will take on a greater importance after the summit. And as I mentioned, hopefully the UN will have something to say about this as the real core of the international legal and multilateral order. Any other questions anywhere? Yeah. So here and if you, I think we have one microphone. So maybe if you indicate or you could come up, then go ahead. Or I could just repeat the question, but whatever you like.
My question is with regard to the access. You spoke a lot about how their access is seeming to be somewhat limited. And in terms of many international organizations are actually moving away from only a multilateral approach to much more of a hybrid, where the other stakeholders have felt more embraced in their opinions and taken with more value. So to what extent is the event that you were at in Nairobi and the event that you're giving leadership to trying to counter that, and by what means, where we try to defend some of the space that we have found ourselves in, without, on the other hand, compromising the reform opportunity by seeming to be a little bit, possibly, as we sometimes have been, a little bit arrogant about the extent to which our opinions should really be taken into account. But how is the access question, you mentioned that a few times, having a bearing upon how civil society will be able to participate?
It's a great question, and as I mentioned in my remarks, when civil society is involved, not only bringing experts to assist governments and injecting new ideas and greater ambition, but also more widely socializing in a national and global context, in the media, etc. These processes, it has the effect of increasing ambition, and many of the most important, I mentioned 3 landmines, ICC and nuclear weapons. Many of these important processes in the General Assembly have led to progress. So the rules of the game allow co-facilitators to set the engagement rules for every. If you go to one UN meeting on drugs and crime, it's a very closed process. If you go to another meeting on human rights in Geneva, it's much more open and inclusive, and so there's different rules for different fora. But this is something that is systemic, and the whole system is up for grabs. It should have been and could have been like the SDGs discussions in 2015, which was a 3-year process, a global consultation process, which helped build expectations. Nobody expected that the Millennium Development Goals would be succeeded by such a robust and 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But that was the outcome, and it's largely due to civil society. So, these access issues do impact outcomes. And but it changes with it's contextual. So there isn't a one set of rules for every UN process. I mean, some fora are much more close than others. You had a question here?
I'm mostly just curious to know if in the process of all of this rethinking of the structure, there's been any acknowledgement of the way certain political leaders have misportrayed and misrepresented the SDGs as kind of a international Kabbalistic attempt to control everything, which has really delegitimized multinational efforts generally, and whether there's any thought in how do we take this restructuring opportunity to kind of re-legitimize that multinational effort.
Well, it's not just the SDGs that are the bogeyman of some of the UN's critics. It's the institution itself. And you know, I mean, we only have to look south of the border and also here in Canada to some of the far right groups that see in the UN, you know, Big Brother and all that's evil in the world. You know, what do you do about it? You know, bullshit is bullshit. You know, we just have to call it out and carry on. I think is, you know, most people who you know what the UN is and it's for. I'm asked by Ruby to suggest to people online that if they have a question, just to put it in the chat and we will get to it. And I will say in terms of Doug's point, I'll get to it in just a second, but I was skating too quickly over some of the peace and security. It was in my notes to reflect that there is a push for a special session recommended in the Rev 1 draft. It's a hard recommendation, and you know, I think seeing it there gives us confidence that there will be a special session on disarmament. So now that we know it's coming, you know, that's a chance for all of us to well, what are we going to do about it? You know, it's a chance, and Doug made some recommendations. But I just wanted to mention that I was getting nervous looks from the organizers about time, so I skipped it, but I probably shouldn't have. There was a question at the back. Do you want to come up, or do you want me to repeat? Sorry, this woman, you were first, and then oh, I see. It's getting to be that time.
Just after listening, Fergus, to the exclusion of human rights and climate change, I'm just wondering, in some of those other discussions, surely some of the parties have noticed towns getting flooded and washed away, or people dying on the street in the north of India, or some of these other things. Where are the entry points for this kind of discussion? I mean, if we're talking about financing for sustainability, it's got to come up somehow. So if you could just tell me where the entry points might be for that kind of conversation.
On the financing for sustainable development, there are entry points in the Rev 1 draft. There's a financing for development conference coming up. There's a strong recommendation for the Secretary General to generate an options paper that will help clarify and sort out many of the problems around and disputes around just what is or is not meant on climate finance. So on the financing aspects, there are definite openings in the Rev 1 draft. On some of the governance questions more broadly related to environment, there's two or three dynamics in play here. I mean, we've just come through a review conference for the Biodiversity Convention, and there's a process for plastics pollution. We've just come through an oceans conference. So this mantra that some governments keep repeating about we shouldn't be replicating existing processes is being used to keep environment off the table. But the fact is that environmental governance is deeply flawed. We know in the Paris Agreement on climate change that the process involves the world coming together to set a global goal, 1.5 degrees below centigrade at a certain threshold, and then something called INDCs, independent nationally determined contributions. So it's up to each government to determine what they're going to do to meet that goal. Whether the sum of all of these governments' contributions actually brings us closer or not to mitigating climate change, you know, is there is no accountability for the adequacy or lack of adequacy of these nationally determined goals. It's the classic paradox of what's euphemistically called, you know, a la carte multilateralism. Governments do what they want, take what they want, you know, and the impacts the world absorbs. That's not good enough. You know, that's so, but if you try and engage a discussion on, I mean, one of the impact coalitions coming out of the Nairobi conference is on creating a multilateral environmental governance network that would include CSOs and other stakeholders, including the UN and governments and so on. That's a process that has been initiated for a couple of years, and Nairobi gives it a push. It's not a UN process, but it's just an effort to get some attention to this environmental governance problem. They're having a tough time even getting a hearing from some of the big players. I mean, big players in CSOs as well as important governments. And the reason for that is, if we recall, the 2015 Paris Agreement, it was preceded by a failed effort in Copenhagen to come to an agreement on what should, you know, follow the Kyoto Protocol and so on. And so Paris was, you know, they felt that this is the best that they can get. And the COP process, Conference of Parties, every year, you know, there were 70,000 delegates at the last one. It's a huge effort. I mean, people feel like this is the best. You know, don't upset what we've got, because it's not going to get any better. But at the same time, we know it's not good enough. So that's the crux of the problem on environmental governance questions. How we deal with that? I mean, there's efforts to involve the ICJ. There's the Law of the Sea Tribunal just made an important ruling on climate change impacts that is, you know, mandates parties to the Law of the Sea Convention, most governments, to take action, whether they do or not, you know, we'll see. But you know, so legal mechanisms are being tried. Human rights, the right to a safe, healthy, and clean environment as a new groundbreaking human right. You know, so there's people are working different angles, different parts of the system, because the core treaty processes are inadequate. But at the same time, as I said, people feel it's the best we have. So I mean, this is like a microcosm of you know, the problem of the nation state system generally. But you know, it is what it is. Yeah, come on up.
I don't know if it's part of what but my question is, well, coming out of the COVID, the gaps between poor and rich is getting bigger and bigger all over the planet, the 1% of the 1% rich. So is it something that you or that the group is discussing on how to financing sustainable development to get the share of the richest of the world, like in individuals, like, or is it just government? Because there's big states, you know, of individual states, of capital in the same place. Is there something about that is discussed?
Yes, there's actually quite a lot. It's the reform of the financing mechanisms, but also some of the policy discussions around sustainable development as well. You know, we all know the inequities. I mean, you know, we were reminded often at this conference in Nairobi that African governments are paying more in debt servicing than they're receiving in ODA. You know, so no wonder, as you say, we're you know, things are regressing. But you know, what gets done about this? There needs to be a different global bargain. So with you asked what we're doing, I mean, you know, there's a lot not to like about some of these governments that you know may try and keep NGOs out of the room and maybe forestalling progress on environment and some of, but you know, their strong call for reform of the international financial and the institutions and the World Bank, et cetera. You know, that's something that we are supporting and hopefully, you know, that, I mean, it's not, I think that the best we can hope for is a procedural push to get the UN, which is a more democratic and equitable institution than the Western-led Washington-based institutions. You know, I think getting, you know, that will be a start, but this is a longer conversation, and that's why I say, you know, the Summit of the Future is a moment in time, and it's an important benchmark, but you know, we need to be in this for the long haul. One more question.
Just wondered what your experience of being in consultations with the Canadian government, and is our ambassador likely to be there during this process? And how are the BRICS playing into this, particularly on international financial?
So just for the people online, it's a two-part question. How has Canada been playing in this process? And secondly, what have the BRICS been doing and saying? Last question first. The BRICS are heavily engaged, and I think when we talk about IFA reform, that's their baby. Brazil particularly. I mean, Brazil is crucially important. The G20 meeting takes place in Brazil this year, and we've talked to some of the organizers of the G20, and they're you know, there's a close the Summit of the Future outcomes and preparations are closely a part of the Brazil's leadership of the G20 and so on. So and we're seeing, you know, more broadly, international financial and trade issues are increasingly the currency of conflict in the world, and the BRICS, as we know, are you know, presenting a major challenge to the Western-led financial institutions. We can each have different opinions on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing or a bit of both, but it is what it is. So they're very active. Some more constructive, I would say, than others. And in the case of China, China's more subdued, but you know, Pakistan is quite often a proxy for China. Russia is playing a bit of a blocking and curmudgeonly role. But anyway, on Canada, Canada's you know, been engaged, been involved, been constructive, not really associated with any particular desired outcome, but just, you know, they recognize Bob Rae was very supportive when the Secretary General introduced the OCA report, and he was effusive, and the Canadian mission has been engaged and involved, and there's teams in global affairs working on this. You know, for my part, I've been kind of out of it as a former Canadian NGO person. I've not really been part of the Canadian scene, and I must confess, I haven't followed closely what Canada's been saying. So I sent an email to the Canadian point of contact in the mission, who is the deputy perm rep, one of the deputies, and he forwarded it for a response. I wanted to know what Canada's, 2 or 3. I knew the group 70A is a foreign policy, bunch of foreign policy thinkers, and they would want to know what Canada's doing, and I didn't have the answer, so I asked them, what do you want me to say? The New York people pushed it to Global Affairs, and Global Affairs haven't got back to me. So I can't really tell you what they're. I asked them for just three bullet points, but that's a kind of a typical diplomatic get this difficult question off my desk response, and you can make of it what you want, but. As Doug said, with respect to the Canadian contribution on disarmament, there's lots to improve. Even I, as someone who's a bit removed from the Canadian context, knows there's a lot more that our government could be doing. But whether we're about to get some new leadership in this country politically, so. We'll see what comes of that.
Thank you, Fergus. Well, I can't help but pick up on that last point, because the point of entry going forward is the upcoming election, federal election, and you can bet that foreign policy is not going to loom as large as we think it should be. So it'll be up to us, who are activists in the foreign policy community, to bring up issues during the election debate, because if we don't, you can bet that we may lament the current government's performance, but other options that are out there competing for power are much worse. And I would implore everyone to think about options for Canada in a global environment, which is in itself also forbidding as we go forward. So thank you and I'd like to thank everyone for coming. And please, if you have any comments or suggestions for either the format or the content of our discussion, please let me know. But I'd like to end by thanking Fergus Watt in particular for his enormous, unending and intrepid ventures into this area. I can't help but remember Greta Thunberg's immortal words when decrying what was happening in the climate area, blah, blah, blah. And if that continues to be the case, I think we'll all be the worse off for it. So thank you, Fergus. Thank you, Ruby, for helping set up. Thanks to the restaurant. And thank you all for coming. And see you next time.